Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska, getting updates to the forecast through that means, or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391, get updates to the forecast through that means as well. Happy Halloween to everybody, but if you do happen to go trick-or-treating tonight, make sure to pay attention to your forecast. Again, that's weather.gov/Alaska. For Southwest Alaska, we are expecting some snow showers and cold temperatures to continue, and in South Central Alaska, some heavy rainfall to continue. Down in the Panhandle, we are looking at some more mild conditions for weather till you get into the Juneau area, where we are expecting some fog to linger. That is also going to inhibit the temperatures from getting too high. Most of the area is going to be around 50 degrees in the Panhandle as we get to 4 p.m. and into the evening, but Juneau will stay a little bit colder due to that fog, and that could also develop again overnight, get a little bit more widespread down there. For some of the warnings that we have out for the state, we do have a flood warning out for the Girdwood area, specifically at Glacier Creek. Total, we could see over 10 inches of rainfall through the area around Glacier Creek, which could raise the flood stage up to a moderate level at 31 feet. Flooding is likely for Tahoe Road and some of the houses farther to the south. If you're in that area, please be mindful of the flooding conditions in the area with some of the rain that we are experiencing. Otherwise, up in the Fairbanks area, we do have a wind advisory out. Could see wind gusts up to 35 miles per hour. Some of those strongest ones are going to be closer towards Eielson and Salcha, with closer to 30 miles per hour in some of the places right around the Fairbanks area. And then south of the area, we do have wind advisories out near the eastern portions of the Alaska Range. And we could see wind gusting up to as high as 50 miles per hour for those locations. And then up in the eastern portions of the Brooks Range, we are seeing some snowfall. Winter weather advisory for snow in those areas could last out into tomorrow. All along the northwest coast and Kotzebue Sound area, high surf advisories are still in effect. Ones farther to the north are going to be in effect until midnight on Monday night. However, the ones around the Kotzebue Sound area are going to be in effect until noon on Monday. Then for the lower Kobuk and Noatak valleys, we do have a winter storm warning out for snow. That's going to be in effect until midnight tonight. Again, you can check weather.gov/Alaska to get any further details for your specific area. Looking at the satellite coverage, we can see some of the lows south of the Gulf of Alaska that are bringing all that cloud cover in over mainland Alaska. We can see some of that pushing in that moisture from the south, where we're seeing that heavy rainfall for South Central Alaska, and that band of moisture out over the western portion of the state that was resulting in a lot of the snowfall, with some of the areas where we could see some freezing precip as well. Finally, out west, we have another system coming in, bringing more precipitation to the Aleutian Islands and Bering Sea areas. So for the weather for the remainder of the day, we'll focus on that system out west first. That one's coming into the western Bering Sea, bringing in some rainfall to the central and western Aleutian Islands, starting to wrap around some of that colder air that's pulling in from the north. At ahead of this, high pressure is keeping the central or the eastern portion of the central Aleutians and the eastern Aleutians fairly dry throughout the rest of today. The southerly flow out over the Gulf waters are bringing in quite a bit of moisture to south central Alaska as well as Kodiak Island. Primarily rain at lower elevations, some snow at the higher elevations. As we move past the Alaska Range, we're going to see snow out to the west coast, all the way up the west coast towards the Utqiagvik area, where there is still some potential for some freezing precip in the central portions of the interior, mixing in with that snow. Then down in the Panhandle area, high pressure is dominating, keeping the skies fairly clear, but we do still have some fog right around the Juneau area. As we move into tonight, we are going to expect that fog to continue around the Juneau area. But then as we move out over the Gulf waters, going to see some rain pushing in, continuing for the south central area with some snow at some of the higher elevations, and then snow for the Copper River Basin areas further north through the Alaska Range, as well as the interior and Brooks Range. Up along the Arctic coastline, we'll see some areas of fog from Utqiagvik east, however blowing snow west of Utqiagvik. Then down the west coast, we're expecting to see primarily snow. And then our system pushing through the Bering Sea is starting to spread precip farther to the east with some rain for the Pribilof Islands, as well as primarily rain down by the central and eastern Aleutians. But behind the main front that's moving through the central Aleutians right now, we are going to see some colder air coming in, transitioning the precip over to snow for the western Aleutian Islands. As we move into Monday, that rain and snow mix line is going to push more towards the central Aleutians and still snow out by the western Aleutians, extending that rain out for the eastern Aleutians as well as the Alaska Peninsula, and starting to push heavier precip into the southwest coast. It's going to start off as snow. Snow is going to extend up the west coast all the way through the northwest coast boundary. And then we'll also have some lighter snow for the Brooks Range, eastern interior, and down through the northern portions of south central. Southern portions of south central Alaska expected to be primarily rain, with some snow at the higher elevations, especially in the Kenai Peninsula areas and as we get into the Chugach Mountains. Down for the Panhandle area, we are expecting to see primarily dry conditions with some rain starting to approach from the south. As we move into Tuesday, we'll see that rain move into the Panhandle, bringing widespread rain to the area, with a chance of some of that being mixed with snow as we get to areas farther to the north. Along the North Gulf Coast, primarily rain, but again, some of those higher elevations expecting to see snow. And as we get to interior locations of south central Alaska, we're going to see snow, and that's going to extend up through all of the interior west coast of the state and through the Brooks Range. Up along the Arctic coastline, not a lot of new precipitation, but some areas out east are going to experience enough wind to cause some blowing snow conditions from some of the snow that's on the ground. And then finally, out for the Bering Sea and Aleutians, our system has finally pulled in enough cold air to bring snow throughout the Aleutian Islands as well as the Pribilof Islands. Some of those areas farther to the east could see a mix of rain and snow. Taking a look at our temperatures for the Panhandle area, getting up into the lower 30s to mid 30s for southern locations, Sitka all the way up to 41 degrees, and then near 30 for the remainder of the Panhandle. Mid 30s throughout much of south central Alaska, with mid 20s for the Copper River Basin. Afternoon highs for the Panhandle, 50s near the Gulf, and then upper 40s as we get into the inside waters, and then into the 40s for the Kenai Peninsula area, and 30s for the northern locations of south central. Tuesday morning lows for the Panhandle in the lower 40s for southern locations, in the mid 30s for areas farther to the north. Yakutat down to 39 degrees. 30s throughout much of south central Alaska. Again, colder down in the Copper River Basin, 25 degrees expected there. Tuesday afternoon highs for the Panhandle area, getting up into the lower 50s for southern locations, mid to upper 40s for our northern locations. For south central Alaska, southern areas going to get into the 40s, and then into the 30s for northern locations, with 46 at Kodiak. Into the interior, to the upper 20s for eastern locations, into the upper teens for western locations, mid-teens along the west coast, and mid to upper teens along the Arctic coastline. Monday afternoon highs in the 30s for eastern locations, 20s as we get farther to the west, including the west coast, and then 20s also along the Arctic coastline. Tuesday morning lows in the 20s for eastern locations of the interior, near 10 degrees for much of the western interior, near 20 for the west coast, and single digits along the Arctic coastline. Tuesday afternoon highs in the 30s for eastern locations, then dropping down to near 20 for western locations, upper 20s to near 30 for the west coast, and in the teens to near 20 for the Arctic coast. Down in southwest Alaska, in the teens for interior locations, 20s near the water, and then 30s for the Aleutian Islands. Monday afternoon highs in southwest Alaska in the 20s for interior locations, 30s along the coast, and then 40s for the Aleutians. Tuesday morning lows dropping down into the teens for interior locations of southwest Alaska, just above 30 for the coastline, and then in the 30s for the Aleutians. Tuesday afternoon highs in the 30s for southwest, and then in the 40s for much of the Aleutian Islands, with 39 at St. Paul.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start with a look at our flying weather on Monday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, we have primarily MVFR conditions with some isolated areas of IFR as that next system moves through. Out over mainland Alaska, central and western locations, you're going to see a mixture of MVFR and IFR conditions that also extends down into the south central area. And then up in the Brooks Range, we're going to see primarily IFR conditions on the southern side, and then starting to get to VFR conditions along the north slope. Down in the Panhandle, VFR conditions are expected Monday morning. Monday afternoon, we're going to still see primarily VFR conditions for the Panhandle. However, some MVFR conditions are starting to approach more northern portions of the area. For south central Alaska, MVFR and IFR conditions expected, and that's going to extend up into the central and eastern portions of the interior with primarily MVFR conditions out along the west coast. Up along the Arctic coastline, a mixture of VFR and MVFR conditions, and then down in the Bering Sea and Aleutians, primarily MVFR conditions, with some isolated areas of IFR as we get to locations farther to the east. Tuesday morning, continuing to see primarily MVFR conditions for the Bering Sea and Aleutians, with our system that's moving in towards the west coast, bringing some IFR conditions to the west coast that extends down into the eastern Aleutian Islands. Out over the interior and south central Alaska, primarily MVFR conditions with some isolated areas of IFR for the Copper River Basin, and then primarily IFR by Prince William Sound. Down in the Panhandle, we're finally seeing some MVFR conditions move into southern portions of the area with some IFR conditions near the Gulf. Then up along the Arctic coastline, primarily VFR conditions. Tuesday afternoon, still going to see mostly VFR conditions for the Arctic coastline, and then we're going to see some MVFR conditions as we start moving into the interior. However, southern locations of the interior are expected to see primarily VFR. Out along the coast, we're going to drop down to IFR conditions, and out over the Bering Sea, primarily MVFR. South central Alaska interior locations going to be MVFR and IFR as we get closer towards the Gulf of Alaska. Down in the Panhandle, MVFR conditions with IFR farther to the north. For the passes, and AKwx should be IFR throughout the day Monday, as well as at Adian Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will both start off IFR and then improve all the way to VFR in the afternoon. Rainy will start off IFR, improving to marginal conditions, and windy should be IFR throughout the day Monday. Isabel will start off marginal and then drop down to IFR, and Mentasta will start off VFR and drop down to marginal conditions. Teanita Pass is expected to be IFR all day Monday, as well as at Portage. Then Chilkoot and White should both be VFR throughout the day Monday. For our freezing levels, we do have some warmer air down by the Panhandle area. Freezing levels up to as high as 10,000 feet just to the east of the area. And our 2,000 foot freezing level moving it towards Kenai Peninsula and the Prince William Sound area, with our surface freezing level out through the Alaska Range and down in southwest Alaska. For our icing, we do have an area of icing from the precipitation out over mainland Alaska extending from the Prince William Sound area up through the interior and Brooks Range, above 4,000 feet down by the Gulf, and above or below 10,000 feet as we get into the interior and farther to the north. Out over the Bering Sea, we have another area of icing above 3,000 feet for eastern locations and above 2,000 feet for areas out to the west. For our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet, 130 knots out of a southwesterly direction over the northeastern portions of mainland Alaska, then 105 knots as we get by Prince William Sound. Some westerly winds out over the Aleutians up to as high as 75 knots. Down to 9,000 feet, still some stronger winds out by the Aleutians, 65 knots by the central Aleutian Islands out of a westerly direction, dropping down to 40 knots by the western Aleutians, and also 40 knots along much of the west coast of the state, as well as the northwest coastline. Down by the Yakutat area, we are going to see some southerly winds getting up to as high as 70 knots and 45 knots for the rest of the Panhandle. Down to 3,000 feet, still some stronger winds out over the Gulf waters, 50 knots to the south of the Panhandle out of a southeasterly direction. Southeast direction with a barrier jet right along the North Gulf coastline by Cordova, 55 knots there. Fairly calm for much of the mainland, but 25 knots out of a westerly direction along the Arctic coast, as well as some outflow winds by the Barren Islands around 45 knots out of a northwesterly direction. Out over the Bering, circulation around our low pressure is fairly strong, up to as high as 55 knots on the north side as well as the southern side of the low, which brings westerly winds 55 knots near the central Aleutian Islands, 45 knots by the western Aleutians, and near 40 knots by the eastern Aleutians. For turbulence, with all those winds, we are seeing quite a few areas of turbulence throughout the Aleutian Islands, below 3,000 feet out west, below 4,000 feet to the east. Kodiak below 5,000 feet, North Gulf Coast below 5,000 feet, and some areas along the west coast as well below 4,000 feet.
Technology. It's the rhythm of our everyday life. We're more dependent on satellite and communication systems than at any other time in history. Disruptions can affect our economy and even our safety. To prepare for the effects of such events and minimize impacts, we need to look outside our atmosphere, some 93 million miles away, at a star we call the Sun. It's our main energy source. It warms the Earth and grows our food. While the Sun and the space between may seem pleasant from our perspective, it's anything but peaceful. At its surface exists a chaotic state of eruptions and radiation. And unlike Vegas, what happens at the Sun doesn't stay at the Sun.
Space weather is essentially emissions from the Sun, radiation, magnetic field that erupts from the solar surface, pumped out into space, sometimes right towards Earth. When it impacts the Earth, it impacts our technology. That's what we call space weather.
These solar events and their effects at Earth can disrupt systems we take for granted. From causing blackouts to the power grid, to delaying offshore drilling operations due to inaccurate GPS data. Interference with communication systems can force air traffic to reroute and impact rescue response and coordination. Outside our atmosphere, solar radiation can harm astronauts and the systems they depend on. The good news is that these eruptions can be detected early. Forecasters at the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, have their eyes on the Sun at all times.
The Space Weather Prediction Center is part of the National Weather Service and is very much like a normal weather forecast office. We're here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're looking at data, we're looking at imagery, we're looking at model outputs. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches of imminent activity to our customers so they can take action.
In many ways, forecasting space weather is a lot like forecasting hurricanes. Those who rely on space weather forecasts, like electric power grid managers, are informed early on and can begin taking protective action.
When we see an eruption on the Sun, space weather forecasters will issue a watch. And this is much like a hurricane watch. When a hurricane sits offshore of Miami, for example, perhaps 48 hours out, we too can see way in advance that something may be coming towards the Earth.
As the storm moves toward us, it hits a monitoring spacecraft orbiting 1 million miles away from Earth.
It's kind of our buoy sitting out there offshore, and that hurricane about 30, 45 minutes before it makes landfall, we'll get the measurements from the buoy. That's what this spacecraft does for us. That big eruption that left the Sun hits the spacecraft. Now we've got the measurements of exactly what's going to impact us here on Earth, and we issue the warnings to give the power grid a heads up that the storm is now imminent. An interesting element to this whole process is that when the forecasters issue the alert, the power grid receives the alert, takes the necessary actions to protect the grid, and the average citizen never knows anything ever happened.
The number of customers who rely on space weather information continues to grow. As our reliance on technology increases, so will our need for constant monitoring of the Sun.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
GPS has changed society. Most people don't realize how remarkable and how many different applications there are.
The GPS has become an integral part, not just of our daily lives as far as cell phones and give guidance for our cars and mapping, but the whole system in agriculture is really relying heavily on high accuracy GPS.
So they're using GPS to plant those seeds with centimeter accuracy. And then they can come behind it and irrigate and fertilize right where that seed is with that 1 centimeter accuracy.
The GPS creates a line for the operator that he can steer along, or you go to another level and the operator doesn't steer anymore and the tractor has an automatic steering system on it, much like a cruise control on a car, except for when I push the button it doesn't drive a set speed. When I push a button it stays on a predefined line.
You don't even need lights. You can do it at nighttime. You program your GPS and it's driving that tractor for you. So it's huge, and it's changing the way that the farmers farm the fields.
6 or 7 days out.
There's an interest in GPS applications from the space weather side because when the sun is eruptive, it causes GPS to falter, and in some cases it doesn't work at all.
Productivity may suffer to a certain degree in that there's no way that I as a human being can steer as good 8 hours a day as a GPS system's going to do. It's going to be the same all day long. Some of the other application technologies, those are going to be gone. We're not going to have the ability to do good section control on sprayers and planters and fertilizer applicators without GPS.
We see a huge growing customer base in so many different industries, so many different sectors now relying on GPS and high precision GPS. They're all big customers for us.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast. We'll start off with a look at our ice edge. The Beaufort Sea is now ice covered, and if we track down the west coast, we can see some new ice along the Yukon and Kuskokwim Delta areas. And we will have that starting to melt away on Monday and Tuesday as some warmer air comes into the picture. However, by the end of the week, we have some colder air moving back in, so we do expect some new ice to form in the YK Delta area. Take a look now in southeast Alaska on Monday. In the inside water, northerly winds 15 knots expected. In southern inside waters, southeast winds 15 knots. Out over the Gulf waters, east to southeast winds 30 knots, get up to as high as 35 knots in the northern Gulf. On Tuesday, in the inside waters, in Lynn Canal area, northerly winds 10 knots, and then central and southern locations, southeast winds 15 to 25 knots, strongest farther to the south. Out over the Gulf waters in the eastern portions, southeast winds 40 to 45 knots, seas up to as high as 24 feet, and then northern Gulf waters, southeast winds 35 knots, seas up to as high as 26 feet. For south central Alaska on Monday, northern portions of the Gulf, east winds 30 to 35 knots, northeast 25 in Prince William Sound, and then north to northwest winds 20 to 35 knots out in the western portions of the Gulf, strongest by the Barren Islands. Northeast winds 40 knots west of the Barren Islands, and then in Cook Inlet, north to northwest winds 15 to 20 knots. On Tuesday, out in the Gulf waters in the north, we're seeing east-southeast winds 35 knots, and then in the western portions of the Gulf, easterly winds 25 knots. East 30 in Prince William Sound, and then in Cook Inlet, northerly winds 15 knots up north, getting up to as high as 25 knots in southern portions of Cook Inlet. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island on Monday, around Kodiak Island, northwest winds at 30 knots expected. On the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, west to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, and then southerly winds 25 knots on the Bering side of the peninsula, and Bristol Bay, calmer winds variable at 10 knots. On Tuesday, northwest winds continuing for Kodiak Island, 20 to 25 knots. Westerly winds 25 knots on the Pacific side of the peninsula, 30 knots out of the southwest on the Bering side, and then in Bristol Bay, southeast winds 15 knots expected. On Monday for the Aleutian Islands, for the central and eastern Aleutians, southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Western Aleutians, we're going to see westerly winds 35 to 40 knots with seas up to as high as 19 feet. On Tuesday, for the central and eastern Aleutians, 25 to 30 knots out of a westerly direction, and then northwest winds 25 to 30, also for the western Aleutian Islands. Along the west coast of the state, primarily southerly flow around 30 knots, most locations from the Pribilofs through the Nunavik Island area. As we get out farther to the north, it's going to switch to easterly winds 30 knots by St. Lawrence Island, and then northerly winds 15 knots in Norton Sound. On Tuesday, Norton Sound southeasterly winds 30 knots, and then 30 knots continuing down the west coast out of a southerly direction. For the more offshore areas, St. Matthew Island northwest winds 30 knots, and then the Pribilof Islands northwest 30 as well. Along the Arctic coastline in the Beaufort Sea area, we're going to see westerly winds 15 knots, and then picking up out of a west to southwest direction 30 to 35 knots for the northwestern coast. Then south of the Bering Strait, easterly winds 30 knots expected. For Tuesday, along the Arctic coastline, east to southeast winds 25 knots, dropping down briefly to 15 knots by Point Lay, but picking up again as we get by Cape Lisburn and areas farther to the south, easterly winds 30 to 35 knots there, and then south of the Bering Strait, southerly winds 30 knots expected. For tonight's weather, quick reminder, we do have several warnings and advisories out for the state. Please check weather.gov/Alaska to get any specific details for your area. So for tonight, we do have some snow continuing for much of mainland Alaska, some areas of blowing snow along the northwest coastline, and areas of fog from Utqiagvik east. Down through the interior and west coast, we're seeing that snow continuing, and then we will have a mixture of rain and snow for south central Alaska, with the southerly flow coming in off of the Gulf of Alaska. Down in the Panhandle, fairly clear for the most part. However, there is some fog by the Juneau area that will redevelop tonight. And then out by the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, another system pushing through, primarily rain for the Aleutian Islands. However, this system is bringing in some colder air, transitioning that rain over to snow for the western Aleutians. As we move into Monday, that snow is going to push closer towards the central Aleutian Islands, but for the central and eastern locations of the Bering and Aleutians, we do expect primarily rain for Monday. Along the west coast of mainland Alaska, however, primarily snow. The snow is going to extend into eastern areas of the interior as well as through the Brooks Range, with a mix of rain and snow for south central Alaska. Finally, on Tuesday, rain is going to return to the Panhandle area and continue lighter snow for much of mainland Alaska, with a mix of rain and snow for south central, and then moving in more snow to the Aleutian Islands.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.